Hi, I'm Ted Morrissey, and this is a video for my course in the classic horror and sci-fi stories by women writers in Lindenwood University's MFA in Writing Program course. We're talking about a couple of stories this week. That have some similarities between them and then some differences as well. So I wanted to just touch base on a couple of things that I think are particularly noteworthy. And then I also want to bring in some other kind of related information, especially as we're getting near the end of the session. There may be some items that we haven't talked about yet too much. And so I wanted to kind of make sure we covered some things in that regard. All right. So specifically, this past week we read "The Eyes" by Edith Wharton, which originally was published in Scribner's Magazine in 1910. Obviously, Wharton is one of the best-known writers that we are studying this session. Most of the writers that we are encountering were popular in their day, but their popularity or awareness of them has faded over time. Not so with Edith Wharton. She is very much part of the picture when it comes to talking about American literature and 20th century American literature and so on. Um, she wrote a wide variety of things. I mentioned on the discussion board that she actually is the author of my favorite poem, a poem titled Terminus. She was not really known for her poetry very much in her day, although she did write, and publish some poetry. And now we don't think of her really as a poet at all, but that was something else that she, played with in her writing career. I shouldn't say played with. I'm sure she took it very seriously. But anyway, The Eyes. And then the other story that we took a look at was Edna W. Underwood's The Painter of Dead Women. Right, and like I said, in many ways, these are quite different stories. Their settings are quite different. The Underwood story has a much more sort of exotic locale, somewhat different kind of narrative lenses they're using. But one of the things they have in common is that they both employ first person narrators. Now, in the case of Edith Wharton, we know that it is a frame story. So we have a narrator who is giving us the narration of another narrator, right? Which was a popular convention in this time period, again, the very early part of the 20th century. I've mentioned that this reminds me of, for example, Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, where we have a narrator listening to Marlowe telling us about Kurtz. Right, reminds me of Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, where we have a narrator listening to another person reading aloud a first person account of this governess. So we have kind of a twice removed kind of narrative posture here. And of course, that particular setting is very, very similar to the setting that Edith Wharton uses in The Eyes, where it is people gathered around to share ghost stories. And then ultimately, this is sort of the eighth story that is shared. And then that's where we get to the main, the main thread of the narrative, kind of maybe a bit of a homage there to Mary Shelley. As we know, the novel Frankenstein was the result of a real life ghost story kind of competition with Byron and Percy Shelley and John Polidori, where they were all kind of cooped up together and decided to try to each write an original kind of ghost story. And Mary's idea that she came up with eventually turned into Frankenstein. Again, very well known. There's been movies and plays just done about that particular episode in her life or whatever. But here we have Edith Wharton, giving us this sort of frame narrative that was, again, quite popular in its day in terms of the sort of once removed or even twice removed narration. The Underwood story is a little more traditional, just sort of first person narrative with an I sort of narrator and so on. One of the things I wanted to talk about in terms of technique, and this is particularly true of the painter of dead women, and let me just read a little bit of it here. Um, it's about a husband and a wife, as you know, and they're getting ready to go to this kind of fancy ball, and the husband says, "I want you to look particularly lovely. All my friends and your old rivals will be there." And so he gives her this instruction. That's a whole nother issue, which many of us got into regarding a kind of feminist critique of this story, or even kind of a Marxist critique. But it goes on. When I took a last look at myself in the glass in the mirror that night, I felt that I had obeyed my husband's instructions. I was looking particularly lovely. I had dressed with the purpose of appearing as unlike Italian women as possible. My slim 6 feet of stature was arrayed in a plain white satin princess, from which the shoulders rose scarcely less white and satiny. My hair was the color of the upland firs, and my cheeks glowed like the roses of an English garden. Right. So, it's a nice little bit of description there. There's some interesting things going on in this story in terms of comparing people to natural features, whether it's the sea, whether here it's the English garden, etc., a rose in the English garden. But that's a whole other kind of affair. What I wanted to particularly talk about was the awkwardness of self-description in first-person narration. Many writers are drawn to first-person narration. It can give a very lively, often informal kind of tone. If you want a comedic narrator, a first-person narrator is oftentimes a good choice. But there is this sort of awkwardness about how does the first-person narrator describe themselves in the way we normally think of characters being described in fiction. Here, the narrator just comes right out with it in terms of describing what she looked like as she was going to this ball. And, she's very proud of the look that she's been able to attain here. It's in the context, though, that her husband asked her to look particularly attractive. And so this is kind of Underwood's vehicle, the context by which she gives a report of how she looked for this particular event. But it is something to think about. How do we as first-person narrators, when we're writing as first-person narrators, how do we describe ourselves? I remember it's something we talked about in workshop when I was, just kind of beginning the whole process of getting a master's degree and so forth. And, there's all sorts of different conventions. Sometimes first-person narrators will catch a glance of themselves in a mirror or a window or something, and it's a way to give a description. Sometimes they can do it in sort of again, kind of a comic mode where they will talk about maybe how other people seem to perceive them. Maybe they'll talk about themselves in comparison to other characters being taller or shorter or older or younger or whatever it might be. But it is a consideration. Obviously, if you're just doing kind of straight third-person narration, you as narrator, as author, can just sort of tell us that this character looks this way, and is wearing these kind of clothes, or behaving in this way, or whatever it might be. But a first-person narrator requires a little more ingenuity, I think, to do well. Obviously, we can just give a description somehow, but we don't want it to be a kind of awkward sort of narrative moment, right? We want to do it in a way that flows in sort of the logic of the text and so forth, right? So that was the main feature I wanted to call your attention to, and in kind of looking up some things to share with you about that, I of course turned to the good book Conversations with William H. Gass. As you know, Gass is my literary idol. I'm working on a paper about Gass for the William Gaddis Conference, which is fast approaching at Washington University in St. Louis. So I've been revisiting a lot of the master's stuff, but he's never too far away from my thoughts or physically from my fingers. And so I go to this book a lot. Again, this is a series of interviews that were compiled. He was a very generous grantor of interviews. This is just a small portion of them. If you go online, you can find several interviews with William Gass that have been published online. Fortunately, for the good of all, there are video interviews that you can find as well. Those are certainly worth watching. But this book is particularly handy, and it is well thumbed. And I have lots and lots of notes throughout. Every time I work on a William Gass paper, I turn to this book to find little nuggets of things he said about his own work or about his theories about writing fiction and so forth and so on. I've just drawn a lot of inspiration from his words and his techniques and his thoughts on what fiction should be and what it shouldn't be and those kinds of things. And I wanted to just kind of turn to one page in particular, this page here, because as I was looking at this morning, I realized, there are several things here that are really worth talking about in terms of writing fiction and so forth and so on. And so I just want to kind of read a little bit from it and maybe expound upon it a little bit. But it says, fiction has traditionally and characteristically borrowed its forms from letters, journals, diaries, autobiographies, histories, travelogues, news stories, backyard gossip, etc. Again, this is Gass responding to an interview question. It has simply pretended to be one or other of them. The history of fiction is in part a record of the efforts of its authors to create for fiction its own forms. Poetry has its own. It didn't borrow the ode from somebody. Now the novel is imagined news, imagined psychological or sociological case studies, imagined history, feigned, I should say, not imagined. And so it kind of goes on from there with some examples. So again, fiction, novel writing, short story writing, is a way to try to sort of mimic these other forms that we have in real life, whether it's diaries or letters or news reports or whatever it might be, right? And in fact, we know that the novel form started in the epistolary mode, right? That Richardson and other novelists of that time period invented the novel as a way of sort of promoting letter writing, right? In hopes of selling stationery and ink and those kinds of things. That's where it all kind of began. And again, it was taken to another level by Richardson and writers of that period. So the novel really grew out of the tradition of letter writing, and then it started to take on these other kind of forms. We've talked about on the discussion board and elsewhere that nowadays writers are playing with using email, text messaging, tweets, all kinds of things to kind of continue that tradition, right, of mimicking the way people actually communicate in real life. So Gass is just kind of referring to that. And then the interviewer, whose name is Macaulay, Carol Macaulay, says, do you have any advice for beginning writers? Do you recommend fiction writing classes? Would you ever teach creative writing? If so, what would be your approach? And Gass says, and this I find very, very significant, my advice for beginning writers is first to recognize that writers differ a great deal in their own natures and in the nature of their talent, and that little advice which is general can be of much value. Learn not to take advice. Look to yourself, make yourself worthy of trust. Right? And I think this is very important. I think when we're kind of just learning craft and kind of getting our confidence and our sea legs beneath us, however you want to say it, we are always kind of comparing our writing to things that we're reading, that we love, etc. And again, it's obviously extremely important to read good writing, to look at it as a writer, in terms of what is the writer doing, in terms of their technique, what can I draw from that kind of thing. Gass definitely encourages that. Find writers that you love, find writers that you respect, read them carefully with an eye to craft and technique, and draw from it what you will for your own writing, style, etc. But this idea of taking advice, of taking criticism, Gass is very wary about that. And to be clear, I'm not poo-pooing the idea of writing workshops. I think writing workshops are very important. Uh, Again, as someone is just sort of beginning to take seriously, the creative writing and so forth, I think writing workshop has a lot of advantages. Obviously, you have a lot of really useful conversations. I know a lot of writers talk about how writing workshop basically was the encouragement they needed to just write things and finish things. And so to kind of get you in the mode of developing ideas and writing finished product to share with your classmates and your instructor and all that kind of thing, that's all very good. But I do think there is a little bit of a danger in taking too seriously all of the criticism that you get when you have a story or whatever it might be that's being critiqued in workshop. First of all, because it's being presented in a workshopping format, I think there is an assumption that there's something wrong with the story, that it's just a mediocre effort, early in someone's writing career, and so there obviously must be things wrong with it, and so people are reading it looking for things to find fault with, and being very eager in some cases to share those faults with you. But again, I think that can be tricky. I'll just draw from my own experience. One of my first stories that I had workshopped was this short story that I wrote titled Mix. And, I presented to my classmates. Then a week later, it was my turn to hear their critiques. And, they pretty much tore it asunder from start to finish. They didn't like this, that wasn't working. That was not an effective description of that. And in this particular workshop class, the idea was to take the story, to rewrite it, and then to present it to the instructor and have a kind of one-on-one conference. So I took all this criticism to heart, and I rewrote the story, mindful of all these different things that were supposed to be wrong with it. Submitted that draft to my instructor, which was Kent Harriff. He was a wonderful teacher, a great writer, and just a good person all around. And went for my conference with Kent. And he basically said, "Okay, this is a disaster." I'm paraphrasing. I'm not quoting verbatim. That basically, I took what was a really a strong story and just made a mess of it by trying to incorporate all these different suggestions for revision and so on. And he gave me probably the best piece of advice I was ever given in terms of surviving the whole workshop experience and getting a lot out of it in the process. And that is, he said, you can't take everything to heart. Basically, people are very subjective readers, and what a lot of people do when they make a suggestion is they're basically making a suggestion of what they would do with the story if it was their story. How would they approach this character or this plot detail or this setting element or whatever it might be. And that ultimately isn't super helpful to you as the individual writer. Rather, probably when you write something, you've got a few questions of your own. You're not 100% sure this bit of dialogue is working. You're not sure if this plot detail is clear or whatever. So when you have your piece critiqued, just kind of have your ears perked up for those things. So when someone in the class comments on those very specific things, they'll either confirm or contradict some of your own suspicions, and that can be very useful. All right. So based on that, I threw out the revised version of the story, and Kent basically told me to go back to the original and just stick with it. I did do one thing just sort of to see what would happen. I originally wrote the story in first person, and I basically just shifted it to very, very close third person. I literally didn't change anything about the story other than wherever it said I wrote he, where it said my, I wrote his, and turned it from a first person story to a third person story. But that was it was just a pronoun shift. I didn't change any of the details of the story. That was it. Ended up sending it around, and it ended up being my first significant acceptance. And it really boosted my confidence a lot, obviously, because I essentially sent out the story that was just from me. It didn't include um, any of the comments from my classmates. And again, they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. They were giving me food for thought, and I initially just ate too much of it. Right, I overate on their food for thought, and so I really think that we need to develop our own sense of what's working and what isn't working, just by our own sort of creative light, as it were. I've been doing this long enough that I've discovered that editors have very subjective responses. Just one other example here I'll give you. I wrote this story I titled Erebus, which is part of Crow Song for the Stricken, and I was, sending it around when I first wrote it to try to get it published somewhere before appearing in the novel later. And one of the places I sent it, a woman that I knew sort of professionally, she was a reader or editor of a journal that had published an earlier story of mine, and then she kind of struck out on her own and started her own journal, and she put an announcement out that she was starting this new journal. What the heck, I'll send her Erebus. And so I did. And I guess because she knew me and had published another of my stories earlier, she felt obliged to explain to me why she was rejecting it. Now, normally you just get a rejection with, that's, no thank you, and that's fine. Some journals will offer to give you a critique, or you can pay a little extra for a critique. I don't care. All I need to know is yes or no, right? But anyway, in this situation, she's kind of volunteered the fact that she and some of her fellow editors talked about the story, and ultimately they decided that they were going to reject it, mainly because they thought the plot device was cliche. Okay, all right, whatever. So that was that. It was fine. So I kept sending the story around, and not too long after that, it got picked up by a journal. And in the acceptance email, one of the things they noted that they really, really liked about the story was its originality. So, literally, the same plot device that one set of editors saw as cliche, another editor or set of editors perhaps saw as really original. So, I don't know what it was, in terms of whether it was cliche or original. I guess it's all subjective opinion, but that's the point. So um, you can't take critique too seriously. So if I had workshopped that story and my classmates had kind of pounced on the plot and pronounced it to be cliche, if I were a more beginning kind of writer, I probably would have taken that very much to heart and basically thrown out the plot because it was too cliche and try to come up with some other approach or whatever. But lo and behold, another editor or set of editors actually really liked the plot and thought not only was it not cliche, they thought it was very original. So you just can't tell. So as Gass says, trust yourself. He goes on to say, no art can be taught, though some techniques sometimes can. Writing classes help some, don't others. It depends again on the kind of person you are. Do whatever works. It wouldn't have worked for me, and I am personally suspicious of them, meaning writing classes. Um, Better to speak of the good things and learn from that. So my approach would be to avoid writing classes if he were just a beginning writer kind of thing. But let me go back to what he said just before that. Better to speak of the good things and learn from that. And that's certainly my thing, which is why I like to teach literature classes in this program, and I don't teach workshop classes. Again, I have nothing against writing workshop classes, but I just feel like when I was in that position that I gained a lot more from the literature courses that I was taking in the creative writing sequence, and just sort of talking about technique and inspiration and all those kinds of things by looking at really well written pieces of writing. I got a lot more out of that as a writer, as a sort of beginning writer, than I did the workshopping classes per se. Not that I didn't get some valuable information from them as well, but I really felt like the literature classes were where I learned the most in terms of helping me to become a better writer. And so Gass definitely recommends that. This is also the interview, which I think really, in which Gass says one of the most important things that any writer has said in the last 50 years or so, and obviously that takes into account a lot of things, but he was still working on his novel The Tunnel, which he had begun writing in 1966. This interview is from 1971, so he'd been working on it for 5 years. We know in retrospect it took him until 1995. Actually, 1992 he finished it. It took another couple of years to get it published. But anyway, the interviewer asks him, can you estimate when your book The Tunnel will be finished or published? And he says, I began The Tunnel in 1966. I imagine it is several years away yet. He had no idea. Who knows? Perhaps it will be such a good book, no one will want to publish it. I live on that hope. Perhaps it will be such a good book, no one will want to publish it. So even in 1971, Gass was already of the opinion that the publishing industry was changing in such a way that the quality of the writing was not the barometer by which it was judged to be published. In other words, the better the book, the more original, the more complex, the more challenging to the reader, the less likely it was to get published, at least by a sort of major publisher, right? I think the situation has only disintegrated since 1971. First of all, there are only a handful of commercial publishers left in the U.S. Depending on how you define commercial, it's maybe 4 or 5 publishers. That's it in the United States, and it looks like there's a lot more than that. But what's happened over the last 30 years or so is that basically these corporate entertainment entities have bought up publishing houses, and so you have just these parent companies, and under them you have what used to be, a dozen different separate publishers, but they've all been bought by the same sort of parent company, and so they use those original publishing house names as imprints, but really it's being published by just this one corporate entity. And there's been several effects of that turn. For one thing, every book is expected to make a profit. It used to be that publishing houses, editors and publishing houses would take a chance on a new voice, knowing that that book wasn't maybe going to sell very many copies, but they were looking to kind of nurture talents and so forth. Cormac McCarthy, I've used as an example in a couple of papers I've written about this phenomenon. He wrote and published books for 20 years before his books started making any money, but he had one editor who was devoted to him and was instrumental in not only publishing his books but keeping them in print, even though they didn't sell well those first 20 years or so. And then finally, he was recognized as this great writer and so on. That's not going to happen today. You're not going to have an editor who champions an author, and certainly not for 20 years of, you know, losing book sales or tepid book sales or whatever. Basically, if a new writer is published, that book better do pretty darn well, or otherwise they're not going to get a contract for a second book. But probably they're not going to get a contract for a first book if that book is challenging and is original and doesn't fit nicely into a sort of a preordained category, right? So again, Gass was kind of predicting, somewhat tongue in cheek, that things were getting so bad in the publishing industry in terms of promoting good writing that it was possible that he was going to write such a good book no one would publish it. And we've certainly gotten to that point here in 2022, where if you write a really, really good book, again, good meaning complex, challenging, original, the odds of finding a publisher are very, very slim. And of course, finding an agent to represent it in hopes of finding a publisher, maybe even slimmer. What's the old saying? It's it's easier to get a book published if you have an agent, but it's harder to get an agent than it is a book contract. Something to that effect, right? So anyway, those are just some thoughts I wanted to leave you with. Again, not to be too depressing here, but I think it is important to kind of realize kind of where we're at. I think there's a tendency to believe that if agents are rejecting us, if big publishers are rejecting us, that it must be because our writing is not good, it's not up to snuff or whatever. But really, that's not the case. In all likelihood, it's quite possible that the writing is too good, it's too original, too creative, too complex, too challenging, and that's why it's being rejected. Which is why that kind of writing ends up in literary journals, ends up with maybe independent publishers, small press publishers, and that kind of thing. And why, quite honestly, a lot of writers have turned to self-publishing, which has been the case pretty much always. Challenging books by new writers, particularly, have oftentimes been self-published or self-funded. But I think nowadays it's just much more prevalent than maybe it even had been in the past. All right, be interested to know what you have to say about any of this. Maybe particularly that first point about the potential awkwardness of a first-person narrator describing themselves as a character in the book. Maybe some examples you have of authors who've been successful with that and how they've done it, or anything you want to speak to, including taking advice or not taking advice about your writing and so forth, so on. All right. So I will look forward to seeing you down the digital trail.